Baking sourdough bread is a multi-day process. Usually when I want to bake the bread on Sunday morning, I start on about Thursday to take the starter out of the fridge and feed it. We talked about the starter before. And now is the time when I can actually set up the dough. That's another 2-day project. I made this little video because during the seminar I don't have enough time. This way we can skip all the waiting times. Sourdough takes a lot longer than yeast bread because there is no actual added yeast. It's all wild yeasts, but the slow fermentation process also makes the bread tastier and healthier. Sourdough bread really only needs 3 ingredients, and that is flour, water and salt. And so my starter is very bubbly and ready to go. So now I can mix the dough. You can not only see the starter is bubbly, you can also smell it. It has a very nice smell. The nice thing about this electronic scale is that I can zero out the scale. So I have a bowl here, fairly heavy bowl, but my scale, I can set the scale to 0 so it doesn't measure the bowl. So we start with a sourdough starter, and that's the only time I go away from the recipe, because I use more whole wheat flour than most recipes, because we just like the taste. So I do need to use a little bit more starter to give that a little bit more power to rise. So 50 grams is what the recipe says. I usually give it 70 or 80 grams, and that works out quite well. Once you have used all the starter that you have set aside for today's bake, don't forget to feed the starter so it continues living. So starter, and then the recipe says 350 grams of warm water. Zero out the scale. You want the water just warm, not too hot, because you don't want to cook the cultures. 350 grams. At this point I use the whisk to mix up the starter and the water so it is nicely uniform. Just find that it then mixes better with the flour. And now I add the flour. It says 500 grams of bread flour. I do have white and whole wheat bread flour, and I use that about half and half. So I add 250 grams of whole wheat bread flour. And about 250 grams of white bread flour. Try to stay as accurate as possible with my measurements, and the electronic scale makes that fairly easy. And now I mix everything up. Again, the special whisk makes it much easier. I used to use metal spoons, that works as well. Wooden spoons are difficult because the dough just sticks too much to them. So I just mix this up roughly, and now let it sit for half an hour covered. I cover my bowls with a wet kitchen towel, and that provides the protection from drafts or anything falling in. It also prevents it from drying out. So I set this away, put this away, and in the meantime I measure out 9 grams of salt. Usually you have about 9 grams of salt for 500 grams of flour. And then we will go to the next step. Okay, so half an hour is up. Now I can mix all the ingredients. I'm taking off the towel. The dough has nicely combined. I decided to add some sunflower seeds to this loaf. Once you know that your recipe works, making additions at this point is a good idea. You can do that at this point. Sometimes you need to soak whatever you put in. If I have a multigrain loaf, I need to soak the grains in for half an hour in hot water. So now I just combine everything. At this point, it does feel a little bit like kneading, although sourdough bread, the way I bake it, has surprisingly little kneading is involved. So I just combine everything so that the salt is equally distributed over the dough. So it's nicely combined. At this time, this dough is not very sticky. Sometimes when it's a little wetter, it's quite sticky. Don't add any flour at this point or anything. Just wait until the gluten starts to form, and it might be just fine. It's probably just fine. Somebody else tried this on the recipe, so just trust that. So I'm going to cover it again with the wet towel and leave it sit for another, let's say, 45 minutes for the next step. So 45 minutes is over, and the dough has started fermenting. So now we're going to help the gluten to form better strands by pulling, stretching the dough from the side and folding it over. Hopefully you can see that. So I'm pulling it and I go around the bowl. It's getting nice and stretchy now. It's going to be even better next time. So it's a nice ball now. It will continue rising and fermenting. And I will repeat this twice. If your recipe says that you don't have to do that, or only once, I recommend you do it anyway. I have never had any dough that has turned out worse with the stretch and pull. So that is really as close as you get to kneading the dough. Just stretching it and folding it over. So the dough has doubled about. This is much more predictable in the winter when the temperature is even. Right now it's a little warmer, so you have to really watch it. If the dough overproofs, it doesn't bake evenly and it doesn't rise as much. So this is nice. It's nicely proofed, about double the size of the ball that we originally had. So the bulk proof is over. Now we're shaping the loaf. Just pulling over, making it nice and round. You can see there are some bubbles from the gas in the bulk ferment. I'm just pinching the ends together here. Now we're going to try making a nice tight shape, nice and round, because it's going to be a round loaf. You can tell the dough is fairly firm, and this recipe makes a fairly firm loaf in this stage. Some of the moisture ones are harder to manage, and then I used a bench scraper to pick it up. In this case I don't need it. I've prepared the banneton. You see that is the basket with the liner. Put some fresh flour in here, and then I pick up the loaf and dump it in the banneton. And now I close this off. This is just a shower cap from the dollar store. It's a perfect cover. Now the dough goes in the fridge overnight for what is called the cold ferment. It's basically the fermentation process continues, but because it's in the cold environment it goes much slower. So I put this in the fridge overnight. Some people leave it even longer than overnight, depending on the recipe. But we're gonna let this rest in the fridge overnight, and then we'll bake it tomorrow morning. So now the oven is preheated to 450 degrees, and I can take the dough out of the fridge after the cold ferment. It looks very nice and round and even, and I can put it upside down on my bread sling. The bread sling has these handles, so that makes it easier to put into the Dutch oven. If I want to have a nice contrast on the pattern that I'm scoring, I can put fresh flour on the top and rub it in. Some people use rice flour because that stays white. I use just a razor blade in my hand. Some other people have different tools for scoring. It just needs to be very sharp to cut into the dough. Because the dough is cool, it is fairly easy to cut. The scoring is there to allow the steam to escape from the loaf and not press the dough down. So I need to make at least one major score fairly deep. And using the safety razor is a really good way to do that. I realized that my arm is always in front of the camera. An O and a C. You can also make smaller cuts. They are more decorative than anything else. But some people make really elaborate scoring patterns, which are great. But today we are not going to do that. Now we are ready to put the bread into the Dutch oven and bake it. So the oven is hot, it's at 450 degrees, and I preheated the Dutch oven with it. So everything is really hot, so my trusty neoprene gloves come in really handy. And so does the bread sling. You can see that I can just drop the bread into the Dutch oven with the handles. Close it. Close the lid so the steam can stay in. Okay Google, set a timer for 20 minutes. Now I'm going to bake the bread with 20 minutes with the lid on, 20 minutes with the lid off, and then it's done because we have a convection oven. And if you have a conventional oven, you might have to add another 10 minutes without the Dutch oven to get nice and crisp crust.